The following program presents principles designed to promote good health and is not intended to take the place of personalized professional care. The opinions and ideas expressed are those of the speaker. Viewers are encouraged to draw their own conclusions about the information presented.
Hello and welcome to Health for a Lifetime. I'm glad you've joined us today. We're going to be talking about an interesting subject, that being trans fats. Now don't turn the dial. It's going to be interesting, I can assure you. Helping us make it interesting is going to be Dr. George Guthrie. He has a great way of making the complex simple. And Dr. Guthrie is a physician at the Lifestyle Center of America in Oklahoma, and he spends all day making the complex simple for people that come from around the country to deal with various lifestyle diseases. And Dr. Guthrie, you've been a doctor now for many years, about 14 years you told me in family practice. You've also taught on the college and university level, medical students and whatnot. Now you're teaching again. I understand that's what the word doctor means.
Yes, it's an enjoyable part of what I do.
And today we're going to talk about trans fats. And why is it that we should be talking about this?
Well, it ends up that trans fats are a significant health risk in our lives. They're in our diet, and their presence actually causes a significant amount of disease. I think we have a graphic for people to look at. It's a quote from a fellow by the name of Walter Willett, who wrote the textbook on, in essence, evaluating the diet of people and looking for the diet effect on disease. Notice this: only one type of dietary fat is worse for you than saturated fat, the increasingly common trans fats. 30,000 or more premature heart disease deaths each year are due to trans fats in our food supply. Now that's a pretty dramatic statement.
That's a powerful statement. So we want to know what trans fats are, what's saturated fat, what's the whole issue with fat. You know, there's a couple things in that quote.
Sure. Let's talk a bit about it.
Okay.
And in order to do that, we really need to understand how fats are put together. Sugars are actually rings of carbons, generally 5 or 6 in the ring.
Okay.
Fats are long chains of carbons. God designed these things that way. It's fascinating to chemists, and I suppose it's interesting to us common folks. Long chains of carbon have hydrogens attached to each carbon. Each carbon has 4 hands. It hangs on this side to a carbon on each side, and when it does it this way, it's hanging on to the hydrogen.
I see.
Now, these long, straight chains stack very nicely.
Sort of like logs.
Like logs. If you're stacking firewood and they're long and straight, it makes a nice straight row that doesn't fall over very well. This is good when you're stacking logs, but when you're worried about the cholesterol and heart attack risk in your body, these long straight fats tend to make your risk of heart attack go up. They raise your cholesterol level and LDL, the bad cholesterol. So these long straight fats or saturated fats are bad. Now, trans fats are actually related to these saturated fats, but before we understand them, we need to understand something about unsaturated fats.
Okay, so we've got saturated fats. Those are the ones that are real stackable.
Those are stackable and
they cause problems because they're big clumps. We're going to talk ultimately about trans fats, so you're going to explain that to us, but before we get there, we have to understand something about unsaturated fats.
We've all heard that unsaturated fats are good for us, right?
Yeah, so what are those?
Well, if you take a couple of carbons in that chain of saturated fat, and they let go of the hydrogen. You see, it was saturated because every hand was full. If they let go of the hydrogen, it becomes an unsaturated fat. Monounsaturated fat. I think there's a graphic to demonstrate that.
Let's look at that, see if we can look at that. Show us what we're looking at here.
You see there on the left, it's called stearic acid. It has 18 carbons. Every hand in the carbon is full of the little gray hydrogen. The one on the right, 2 hydrogen have been let go, so it's no longer saturated. It is unsaturated. And unsaturated fats are bent. The bent makes them less stable, and in their physical state, they're actually more likely to be liquid.
Okay, so the saturated then are stackable, and they get all together, they cause problems.
That's correct.
The unsaturated, they kind of bend, and so they don't stack easily, and they can just kind of float away.
That's right. Now, you and I, when we deal with these fats in a physical state on the table, prefer, for example, the one that was straight that we saw on the graphic was actually what you'd see in butter, and that's something you could spread. The one that's bent doesn't stack nearly as well, and it comes out like an oil, and that's hard to spread. So we prefer the long straight ones in some of the ways that we eat fats.
Can you get anything that spreads? Because I really like spreading.
Yes, we like spreads. Unfortunately, as we look at our fats, we find out that the more solid they are at room temperature, the worse they are for us. But we're getting a little off track there.
Okay. Well, you know, just forgive me. Well, what's the next thing we need to know about these trans fats? You've made the complex simple and helping us understand this stackable versus unstackable, and I'm sure we want to have the unstackable, the liquid forms, but what do we need to know next?
Okay, we know that the trans fats are straight, they act that way. We know that trans fats are not good for us, so we as the American public, having been told this by the scientists, are asking industry to please give us fats that are unsaturated. So industry wanting to give us unsaturated fats have had a dilemma because we still want to be able to spread it, you see?
Right.
But if it's unsaturated, it is actually not spreadable. It's more like an oil.
Liquid. Okay.
They came up with a solution.
A solution that probably helps them, but maybe doesn't help us?
Well, it helps us because it gives us what we want on both accounts. We want unsaturated and we want to be able to spread it. So this is what they did. You ready?
Okay, what did they do?
They took unsaturated fats, they put them under high heat.
Okay.
They put them under pressure.
Turned up the heat, put them in a pressure cooker?
That's right. Over a period of time, 6 or 8 hours, something like that.
All right.
And instead of having a fat that is bent like this, it actually does this to them. So they're still unsaturated, but now they have a little jog in them, and they're straight. They can call them unsaturated, and we smile because we look at the label and we say it's unsaturated, but it acts like a saturated. It can be spread.
Okay, let me see if I understand this. So you have this, this is a saturated one that's all just straight, but then they put a little crook in it, so it's like that.
You're kind of close. Here, let's try it like this.
All right.
Okay, you've got a saturated fat. Now you have an unsaturated fat.
All right.
Okay, looking like that. And then when you turn into a trans fat, you do this with it. So it's very similar to a saturated fat. It's just kind of jogged over a little bit, but it's lost the bend. When it does this, it'll stack like good firewood, but we can call it unsaturated, and so we're happy.
Okay, and this is really dangerous, like you said. I mean, our first graphic was this causes a significant amount of actual deaths because that's really just like the saturated fat in terms of what happens in our body. It makes the cholesterol go up and does all those bad things.
Exactly.
So what do we do?
So what do we do? How do we avoid it?
Yeah. Or are there other kind of fats that we need to know about before we talk about that?
Well, there's another fat that might be interesting before we delve further into it, and that's the polyunsaturated fats.
Okay.
We've helped you understand that when it's unsaturated, it's got a bend in it. That would be a monounsaturated fat. If we actually have several of these, we end up having a polyunsaturated fat. So
I think they need a wide angle of you. Look at this. Okay, do this again. All right, do that again. How's it go?
Okay, you've got a saturated, then you've got a monounsaturated,
right.
and then you start going polyunsaturated, and you get these things that are all bent up in odd sorts of ways. These are sometimes called, some of them, essential fatty acids. They're more complex fats that have important functions to do in our body.
So the more they curl up and everything, I mean, we could turn this program into an exercise video at home. Let's do the saturated, let's do the polys. Right, but when they go from saturated to, you know,
to the unsaturated,
to polyunsaturated, they're less and less dangerous, yes or no?
Well, the polyunsaturated fats have a lot of benefits to our body. They tend to help insulin resistance. They tend to help the cholesterol come down. They improve lots of things.
Okay.
Generally, these fats, they don't get changed from trans fats into polyunsaturates. They actually come in foods. For example, soybean oil will tend to be a polyunsaturated. Now, it'll have a little trans fat, it'll have a little bit of saturated fat, and a little bit of monounsaturated fat, but it has some more of the polyunsaturated fats.
Now, you have a graphic that shows kind of all of these together, right?
Okay, before we get to that one,
all right.
In essence, what that graphic is trying to demonstrate is that when those fats are put through the trans process, they are actually changed in some really weird ways, because not every one of those bends will be affected in the same way. So one might, see it kind of off in some funny angles. Let's see that graphic to demonstrate that.
All right.
On the left there, you see a trans fat, and you see the little bit of notch
there, yeah.
the little crook just after it says fat. The next one over is a polyunsaturated fat, and that would, of course, be good. It has several bends in it. Now, next to that is a partially hydrogenated fat, and you see some of the bends are straightened out, but others are not. Then there's a fully hydrogenated fat where all the hydrogens have been put back, and it's changed from a
it's just completely flat.
It's completely straightened out, just like a saturated fat. And that last one is kind of a mixture. You see that it's partially hydrogenated and it's a trans fat. There's a little nick in it, which makes it straight. The dilemma from these particular fats is actually that they tend to clog up some of the enzyme systems in the body.
Okay. All of them do?
No, I think they're probably formed somewhat randomly during the process of this hydrogenation or partial hydrogenation.
So when you kind of heat them up and do all that stuff, you never know what they're going to do, and in essence it could clog something up differently than you expected.
Right. One of the questions that people ask me as I talk about this to them is, when I use a polyunsaturated fat to cook, am I making trans fats?
When you heat it up.
When you heat it up. I mean, if I take my canola oil and put it in the pan and I heat my food up, am I going to make it into a trans fat?
What do you say?
The answer is generally no, because the temperatures and pressures need to be so high to actually do this. And it often takes hours, and they use like a nickel type of a helper chemical inside it to make
so
it.
You can't do that at home unless you're a really bad cook.
Unless you're a real bad cook. Not something to worry about. But the polyunsaturated fats can be hurt by cooking, but generally you don't turn them into trans fats.
We've been talking with Dr. George Guthrie from the Lifestyle Center of America. He spends all day talking to people about how to improve their life through lifestyle changes and through understanding things like we're talking about today, fats and trans fats. And it's been fascinating to look at the complex and make it more simple to help us understand. When we come back, we're going to look even closer at this subject of trans fats and how they affect us. We hope that you join us when we come back.
Have you found yourself wishing that you could shed a few pounds? Have you been on a diet for most of your life, but not found anything that will really keep the weight off? If you've answered yes to any of these questions, then we have a solution for you that works. Dr. Hans Deal and Dr. Eileen Ludington have written a marvelous booklet called Reversing Obesity Naturally, and we'd like to send it to you free of charge. Here's a medically sound approach successfully used by thousands who were able to eat more and lose weight permanently without feeling guilty or hungry through lifestyle medicine. Dr. Deal and Dr. Ludington have been featured on 3ABN, and in this booklet, they present a sensible approach to eating, nutrition, and lifestyle changes that can help you prevent heart disease, diabetes, and even cancer. Call or write today for your free copy of Reversing Obesity Naturally, and you could be on your way to a healthier, happier you. It's absolutely free of charge, so call or write today.
Welcome back. We've been talking with Dr. George Guthrie from the Lifestyle Center of America. We've been talking about trans fats. And we've learned several interesting things about trans fats. We've learned, first of all, they're very harmful to us. And Dr. Guthrie, again, let's just summarize here. I mean, we should be having a wide shot of you when you're making these motions here. But you know, the trans fats versus the saturated fats, I guess, let me see if I'm right. Mm-hmm. The saturated fats, when you look at them in the body, they're just completely straight across.
That's right.
But once they get no, that's saturated fats.
That's saturated
fats. But then once they get heated up and all kinds of things done to them,
you're almost there. We actually get the trans fats from the unsaturated fats.
All right.
So they're bent, right?
They're bent.
They're bent.
And then they try and straighten them out.
They straighten them out, kind of funny-like, so they got a little bit of notch in them.
Okay, but and we like that because they act like saturated fats, which we like so much because we can spread them on things and eat them and everything. But they really are pretty harmful to us. We looked at those quotes by Walter Willett about heart disease. Well, let's come back now and talk more about the problems. I mean, some people out there listening say, you guys are making all these motions, looks like an exercise video, you're talking about fats. But you know, those that have hung with us, they're saying, wait a minute, so what's the big deal about this trans fats? What's the problem with it?
I made a little list here. Let me kind of go down through it. Trans fats tend to raise the total cholesterol.
And that's bad because every elevation in cholesterol increases your risk of
heart attack.
Okay.
That's right.
All right.
And it increases the bad cholesterol, the LDLs.
Okay.
It also decreases the good cholesterol, the HDLs.
That's the ones that pick up all the trash.
That pick up all
the LDLs are the ones that are trash all over the place.
That's right.
Okay.
It increases something called Lp(a). Now, this is one of those things that is associated with increased clotting in the blood, makes it more likely to clot.
So you could have a clot or a stroke or a thrombus or something.
That's right.
Okay.
It increases the triglycerides. It increases, as we mentioned, the platelet stickiness. And there's even some evidence that it worsens insulin resistance, increases the risk of diabetes, and possibly even Alzheimer's disease.
Boy, for just a tiny little thing, it really makes a lot of problems.
It sure does.
That's like maybe someone's little brother.
It's certainly something that I'm trying to avoid in my diet, as I have learned how important it can be in causing disease.
Well, we've talked a little bit about the problems and the dangers. You were talking with me about a study that kind of elucidates this even further.
Why don't we put that up as a graphic, and I think we'll be able to look at this study actually from the Nurses' Health Study. Notice that elevation in trans fats of 3% of total calories increases the heart attack risk, in essence, 53%. In those, compared with those with the lowest trans fat. That, in essence, works out to be about 4.5 grams of trans fats per day, actually making about a 50% difference in heart attack rate.
Wow, so just having this little tiny bit of trans fats can just increase your risk of heart problems from trans fat 53%. 50%.
Yeah, 4.5 grams of trans fats. There may be that much in a donut.
Boy, you're now. Oh man, I bet you there's a gasp. I can't even. People in their homes are going, a donut.
Well, they're called do-nots for a reason, Don.
So that can really put you at high risk. Is it a sudden thing?
No, generally it's a slow sort of a thing, but the risk builds, and The scientists are telling us this is an extremely important item as far as our cardiovascular health is concerned.
So where do we find trans fats in our diets? I mean, we've already said donuts. It might be one of the things. Where else do we find them? I mean, donuts are a pretty obvious thing. I think maybe everybody that has a donut, they kind of go, well, you know, I can maybe have one of those or two of those or maybe 5 of those, but no more. You know, they know it's probably not the best thing. Where else do we find them?
You know, it's really hard to identify all the trans fats in our diets. We're not exactly sure how much we're actually getting, because it's used in so many places. For example, things like custards and puddings, baked goods, wherever those long straight fats actually bring out the best consistency, pie crusts for that matter. So it's really all through our processed food chain, if we put it that way.
There are no trans fats, yes or no, in plant products?
It is my understanding that that's the case. There are not even very many trans fats in animal products if they're taken, for example, if you had meat. There might be a little bit because the bacteria in the stomach of the cow may make a few trans fats. But generally, it's a oil processing problem that leads to this trans fat.
So things like French fries?
Okay, maybe, especially if they're done with unsaturated vegetable oils.
So give me a list, like what kind of things? Like baked products, where you're talking about pie crust. So
sure, that would be a good one. Breads, you know, it's so ubiquitous. You may have to start looking at labels to find it.
Ooh. Looking at labels. But the simplest thing, if you don't want to look at labels, is just eat food just grown.
That's right. If you get it out of the ground, in essence, the vegetables, the fruits, the whole grains, you're not going to have any trouble with trans fats. It's a processing issue. As we try to take unsaturated fats, make them act like saturated fats in our prepared foods.
So none of the birds or the cows out there, or the goats or whatever, they're not going to drop over dead from the trans fats.
I don't think that'll be a problem.
Okay, so then you said, but if we really want to know, if we get into processed type foods like your breads, your pastries, your cakes, your whatever you like, or whatever maybe you need to move away from, you can tell by looking at labels.
In January of 2006, the government has said they're going to start putting or requiring that people who label food actually put on there how much of the trans fat is in the food. So, I mean, that's a ways to wait, especially if you think it is really important. Notice the label that we have up on the screen. One of the ways you can actually find out is to look at the fats on the label. If you look at the total fat, subtract out the monounsaturated fat, the saturated fat, and the polyunsaturated fat. Just take those completely out. The number that you have left is actually the trans fat that's left over.
So if you have a label and it says on it, okay, I've got 100 grams of fat, say. Or
oh boy, that's a big one.
That's a big one. Let's just have a simple number,
okay.
Though, right?
Okay.
And it lists poly and it has 25.
Okay.
And it lists mono and it's got 25. And what would be another one I put in there?
Polyunsaturated.
All right. Polyunsaturated is 25. I got mono, it's 20.
So you got mono, the mono, the saturated, and the polyunsaturated. You add those together.
And then say I have 75. Whatever not listed there, that's the trans.
And subtract it away from the total, and what's left is the trans
Now,
fat.
at this point, do they have to put all those numbers on there we suggested?
No, they don't have to.
What do they have to put on right now?
Well, they need to put on the total fat. And
Okay.
many people are putting, or many food manufacturers are putting on the saturated fat or the unsaturated fat because they want us to know.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another way that you can tell, though.
How can you tell?
If you'll go over on the label to the list of ingredients. The list of ingredients on the label has first those ingredients that are most, and then it goes down by, in essence, if I remember correctly, weight. If it says in the list of ingredients something like partially hydrogenated soybean oil,
Oh.
If it ever says partially hydrogenated, you know that that has trans fat in it. Oh, yes, one of my favorites is popcorn, that microwave popcorn. And so far, the ones I've seen all have trans fat in them. So I've had to switch just for my health.
So do you eat popcorn?
Oh, yes, but I'm popping it myself, not having the microwave do it now.
I see, and that gets rid of the trans fat.
Well, look on the label. Maybe they'll come out with one that doesn't have the trans fats in there.
So even if it says on there, like the microwave popcorn that I get, it says X amount of percentage less fat.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that it's getting rid of all the trans fats.
It may be low fat, and the fat still may be trans. As a matter of fact, they'll probably say, "I'll bet Dawn wants unsaturated fat in this, but you know we need it to kind of, we don't want it to be oil floating around in the bag, so let's partially hydrogenate it so it will stay still in the bottom of the bag until it heats up."
So what do you? I mean, you deal with people every day throughout the year at the Lifestyle Center of America in Oklahoma, where you practice as a physician, and you're creating training programs also for people to do in their communities as well and to use. You know, a lot of people out there, they love certain things that I'm sure are trans fats. I mean, we mentioned some of them, donuts. We mentioned, I mean, you know, the list went on with popcorn. I mean, you almost are not a person if you don't eat those things. How do you help people change?
Boy, that is a challenge. Fortunately, our palate is educatable, and we can actually learn to like things. One of the things that's been most helpful for me and for those that I'm teaching is simply understanding. You know, when you don't know, the taste seems more important than anything else. When you understand that there are problems from it, remembering that helps one steer away from those things that are bad for you.
So that's how you help people avoid it, just by education.
By education.
Education, education, education.
I can't follow them home and say, you can't have that. It has to be their choice. They need to be convinced in their own minds.
And in your own life, was there a time you really enjoyed the trans fats and then you had to make a decision to change?
Yes, sir. I just kind of made this discovery about a year ago, and there's a lot of things changing in my household as I've discovered the problem here.
And the Lord's giving you the strength to do that.
Exactly. And what's more, knowing this helps me make maybe even better choices, because there is a principle behind it all that we shouldn't forget. And that is, God made food that was good for us. It seems that the more man kind of manipulates it and changes it, the more problems he caused. So what that's done is pulled me back from some of the crackers, for example, and baked products that may not have been so good for me, and moved me towards whole grain type cereals, fruits, and vegetables. Food as grown, we like to say.
So the people out there, I mean, if I was listening to this for the first time and hearing these things, I'd say, boy, I need help here. I can see that I've got all kinds of trans fats. It's causing problems for me. What kind of hope can you give them in the last few seconds here?
Well, I think changing is a bit of a challenge. One of the things you can do is actually make sure trans fats are way down on the label.
Okay. So move them to the side of the plate instead of the middle of the plate.
There you
first
go.
off, and just keep trying. We're glad you've joined us on Health for a Lifetime, and we hope that you have health that lasts for a lifetime.